We heard the Easter bells pealing the next day, and we prayed fervently for God's protection. Christ was risen, and we were free. We had to stay in that disgusting tarp for 3 days. I later thought that was how long Jesus was in hell, and it felt about the same to me. There was one very tense moment I will tell you about. We were stopped, and a man demanded that we remove the tarp. Well, Mr. Coke was very quick in saying, "And stink up the entire countryside? I don't think so. Can you smell the herring?" He said to the officer. The officer said, "Absolutely, I am so hungry, I could eat the herring." He said, "Well, those hungry nuns, they were so hungry after Lent and the fasting, I gave them all the herring. If I had one, I would surely give it to you." And the man said, "Okay, be on your way." Well, our hearts had stopped beating. And we just went on our way, and we got to Wittenberg. We had not been discovered, and God has been with us. The first days in Wittenberg were tense. We had no idea what would happen to us. We were fugitives. We were runaway nuns. The first words I heard from Dr. Martin Luther were like a mountain stream. He told us about how he had done everything to please God. He said, if I had fasted any longer, it would have killed me. But he was still convinced that he was not doing enough. He was following all the teachings of the church. Later he told us how his striving and striving to be good enough to please God had no end. And that is why he came upon the realization that salvation is obtained by faith, not penance. Dr. Luther explained the cornerstones of his faith, and we listened intently. Now, as you know, Martin Luther wrote volume after volume after volume, which probably most of you have read. But if not, I will summarize it very briefly. One of the things Dr. Luther said was that Rome's constant thirst for money was so disturbing. He said the church felt they needed rivers and oceans of money. Indulgences were the way you paid the church to get away from sin. The history of indulgences, Dr. Luther told us, went back to the Crusades. If you couldn't fight in the Holy War, you could pay money to support a crusader. And thus you were paying for the forgiveness of sins. Later, sermons were preached about the fires of hell, and people were implored by a man named John Tetzel to give money to release loved ones from purgatory. He said this, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." And Tetzel was boasted that he had sent more people to heaven than even St. Peter. But you'll note that he became an extremely rich man because he pocketed much of the indulgences. Dr. Luther's disgust for Mr. Tetzel's tactics was clear. This was one of the reasons that he had nailed the 95 Theses to the castle door on All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1517. So, we were the escaped nuns people talked about. And we lived with families who would take us in. I lived with the mayor's family. It was more comfortable than I'd ever been in my life. However, the lady of the house had quite a list of things for me to do each and every day, working sometimes 12 to 14 hours. I had the chores of making the beds, tending the garden, washing clothes. Now, I hear you have contraptions to do that today. We had no such thing. Scrubbing the clothes, dusting, feeding all the animals, mending clothes, and all this time with a demanding lady in the house telling me to get busy. Well, there was joy, because a man by the name of Jerome Baumgartner and I had spent quite a bit of time together, and, well, we'd fallen in love. He had asked me to marry him, and I was so pleased. I said, yes, I would love to. He explained that he would have to go ask his parents' permission. So, while Jerome was away with his parents, I prayed, and I was so excited about our future together. I spent much of the time just daydreaming. Time passed slowly, and 1 month, then 2, and then 3. Jerome was away. Why hadn't I heard anything from him? Each week I wrote him a very affectionate letter. Well, after a while, I became quite depressed and anxious. And news then came that my father had died. So it was a very hard time in my life. Life was bleak. The days and months, they stretched on and on. All the other nuns had found jobs or husbands, or they'd returned to their families. And I had no such options. I felt like I was the only one left that no one wanted. What would happen to me? So I said to Dr. Luther, I told him about my sorrow. And he said, Katie, are you willing to follow God's will? And I said, yes, I was. And he said, well, perhaps you are not supposed to marry Jerome. I know someone who may want to marry you, he said, but I have taken it upon myself to write Jerome a letter and ask him exactly what his intentions were. Later, in passing, I heard that Jerome's parents did not want him to marry me because I was poor. And he did not even have the kindness to write me about it. And now I heard he was engaged to a very wealthy young woman, which made his parents happy. So I climbed again the steps up to Dr. Luther's study, and I poured my heart out. Let me tell you what was happening in the world. Europe was on fire theologically. Dr. Luther told how his life was threatened after he posted the Wittenberg door. He was then sent to Worms to stand trial for heresy, and a death sentence was imposed. Then he was kidnapped to spare his life. A man by the name of John Huss had been burned alive in Rome because he had followed Luther. Things were moving fast, and 2 other men were burned alive for denying the Pope in Brussels. Well, that was happening in the world. In my life, let me get back. I had stated that